On today's show, we're gearing up for a fun Friday edition of the podcast talking about Xander Bogaerts, because I've seen some people talking about him, and whether or not, is he just the new Eric Hosmer in the sense that is he the new massively disappointing player on a big contract that isn't going to help take this team to the next level? Why he is, why he isn't, and why we have a little bit of optimism heading forward, and more. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Friday, March 7th. As always, I'm your host, though, with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You can follow me on Twitter /X and Blue Sky at Javipeno, the best handle in the game, JAVIIPENO. Feel free to go check out my other related baseball work at justbaseball.com, as well as my other podcast, Baseball vs. the World, which is about quirky, fun, and somewhat pop cultural related baseball topics. You know what to do. Just follow the links. You know, you people know how to do that, and you'll find the rest. Today's episode, guys, though, speaking of other venues, I couldn't think of a transition there. Whatever. Today's episode, guys, is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. And today's, folks, it's going to be a fun one. Look, every past few weeks, we've been trying to just have a little bit of fun on this podcast, come up with some fun topic ideas. Last week was Michael Baumann of Fangraphs talking about Jackson Merrill and whether or not he can keep it going, why he might not keep it going. And this one is based, and I don't usually do this because I think over these last 5-6 years or so, I have genuinely not realized, but even more taken into account that Padres Twitter isn't necessary, and Padres Reddit and the internet isn't necessarily indicative of all the fans, right? So that is true. That being said, I have been seeing lately, and it could just be me, right? But I feel like I've seen a little bit of an influx of people talking about how they think that, Xander Bogaerts really is the new Eric Hosmer. And I think that is kind of a death nail thing to say for Xander Bogaerts, where it's Eric Hosmer. While I'm going to actually spend a decent amount of this episode defending him in some ways, because I think that there are, while a lot of justifiable reasons to be upset with him, and he was my sworn nemesis on this show for a while. I refused to call him by his name, for example. That was an ongoing bit we did. It was so dumb, but I just think it was fun because I loved hearing everybody else's reactions to the fact that I wouldn't say his name. But no, in all seriousness, we're going to talk about that because there are ways in which they've been similar in terms of their actual play style and production, and in terms of their off-field type of vibes and just what they meant. And I think that it's actually kind of interesting. So we're going to get to it. First, let's start with the circumstances of their signing, which to me is the single most one-to-one comparison between these two, right? With Eric Hosmer back in 2018, this was a bit of a shocker, right? It was pretty shocking when it happened, for sure. And it was a team that probably didn't need him, the 2018 Padres, right? The 2018 Padres still had Wil Myers. And Wil Myers, while you might be thinking to yourself, well, Wil Myers wasn't that amazing, was he? He wasn't, but he was also a decent batter. He actually had some value, and he did just get to the team. And I think a lot of people were surprised because Wil Myers actually played a pretty decent first base. Weird, right? It's actually kind of weird when you look back at that. Wil Myers wasn't a very good defensive player in the outfield, particularly in right field. That's where he played most of the time. But as a defensive player, he actually wasn't too bad with the Padres for all those years that he was there. He actually had an outs above average mark of 9 one year. He was pretty positive in that respect. He had some good seasons, 2016 being his best one with 8 defensive runs saved, and he was just okay, right? He wasn't doing anything amazing there, but those last couple seasons with the Padres showed that he was at least able to play that position a decent amount. And then you look at Eric Hosmer, who was a player that everybody was just kind of there's no way that he's going to keep up with this. He's coming off a career season, coincidentally, right, with his contract year, right? So do you really want to buy in on a player who up to that point had been the ultimate every other year wonder? First year, 1 win above replacement. Second year, minus 1.4 wins above replacement. Year after that, 3.1 wins above replacement. Year after that, minus 0.2 wins above replacement. Then 3.5 positive wins above replacement. Then 0.2, then 3.7. And then the rest is kind of history, right? He basically peaked after that season with the Royals. Obviously helps them win a World Series. He's a legend for that. But with Eric Hosmer, you kind of didn't need all that much. And his stats were very, very bad defensively, right? Even when he was having good season with the Royals, right? He had one season in which he had, 7 defensive runs saved, but then he had a -2, -5, 2, -6, 3, -4, -5, -10 abouts above average, actually, his first season with the Padres. Like, this was a position you didn't really need. I think was a big part of that. And it was a shocking signing for a lot of money. And you know what? Xander Bogaerts does have that comparison, and I understand why people kind of are reminded for it. Not just in terms of the amount of money that was handed out, and I think that at the time, the Eric Hosmer contract was considered an overpay, and I say that in quotes because I think overpay in baseball is just something that I don't, and frankly in sports, I just don't always know what that means, right? Because part of me is like, well, are they really good? That I get the criticism because of luxury tax and all that sort of stuff and the amount of budget that you have, but especially in baseball when it's just cheap owners, like I don't mind that as much. But that being said, at the time the Eric Hosmer contract was considered like, wow, that is a lot of money for a player that, yes, he's got the World Series acumen, he had some moments in the playoffs, but he's been very inconsistent and he hits the ball on the ground too much and he doesn't hit for as much power as you would like for a first baseman. And the Padres give him that big deal. Xander Bogaerts was a shocker for sure at the time when it happened. And here's the big comparison. He is also a player that you could argue the Padres did not need. On top of the fact that at the time, when they make this signing, you still have, I understand that he was a mess at shortstop in certain areas, but he certainly had the athleticism and did showcase upside. I believe winning a Gold Glove in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Mr. Fernando Tatis Jr., like he did show some sides of being like a really quality shortstop. Right? Like he did have those moments. And then even more than that, he has a Gold Glove at shortstop. I knew it. I knew he did. When did he get that? Was it the 2020 season? When did he get that? Was it just 23? I guess it was just 23. Huh. Anyway, whatever. But bottom line is some of the advanced statistics outs above average, Tatis was flirting with being a good defensive player. But let's ignore that for a second. Let's instead look at the rest of the team. You had Ha-Seong Kim, who literally was winning a Gold Glove, and that was primarily his value, was being an awesome defensive player. And then you also look at, they have Jackson Merrill in the minors, who at the time was an infielder. And then they had to, he famously transitioned brilliantly into the outfield. But I don't think that at the time they were like, we know 3 years from now, or we know years from now that we're going to be able to, or next year, we know that he's going to play outfield great, right? And it's just weird considering you have Merrill, considering you have Ha-Seong Kim, that you make this signing, right? When you already potentially have this base covered. But then again, what do I know? But it is a little bit of a similarity. So that's one similarity between the two. And the next similarity is that they both have been dangerously scary when it comes to their production on the field, right? The first year with the Padres, though, not the same. He was disappointing in terms of when you watch the games, the fact that he did not drive in any runs. He was one of the least clutch players in all of baseball. Same with that team. We've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast all the time. We talk about this, right? Like that Padres team was cursed in 23 and they could not drive in runs to save their life. Manny Machado double plays, Xander Bogaerts double plays, Trent Grisham, dribblers down the right line, right? And he just never got out. Jake Cronenworth wasn't doing anything. He was a below 100 WRC plus guy, right? So I understand that. But Bogaerts was actually still overall, the skills were there in that first season, right? And this is one of the reasons that I want to defend Xander Bogaerts a little bit on this podcast, right? Xander Bogaerts' wins above replacement was 4.7 in 2023. Eric Hosmer's combined wins above replacement, according to FanGraphs, from 2018 to 2022 was 1.2. So this is already something that I disagree with vehemently, the idea that Xander Bogaerts is the next Eric Hosmer. But there's other reasons for that, and there's other reasons for why it may be true. And we're going to get into those in just a second, guys. But first, just need to take a second to talk about one of our sponsors. That's right, folks. Today, we are talking to you about our good folks that we talked about at the top of this episode. That is FanDuel, because when the game tips off, The NBA action, it's only getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. I love it. I love using FanDuel's live betting features. Keeps track of every moment of the game, whether I'm backing my team for a late rally, or if you're just like, oh, I need this player to hit a couple more threes and get a few more boards. Feel like you never have an opportunity to miss out, right? I should have phrased that differently. You always have the opportunity to be back in the game, right? And right now, new FanDuel customers, speaking of being back into the game, they can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. And just like that, guys, we are back, thriving and vibing into the second segment of this podcast. Love it, don't we? We just love it. Love it. On this fun Friday. Remember, go check us out, First Listen every day, and follow me on Twitter/X and Blue Sky, JAVIIPENO. We're just talking about Eric Hosmer and the total F4 comparison, and why that immediately is why you can't necessarily say that Xander Bogaerts is the new Eric Hosmer. And by the way, even last year, he was still a productive player, more so than what Eric Hosmer was, right? He had actually like a decent wins above replacement mark, considering that he was all injury battled and whatnot, right? He had 2 wins above replacement last season, which is not great, but even still, in 111 games, when you're dealing with all those injuries that he'd been dealing with, you could do a lot worse, right? But here's the thing. I understand what you might be thinking, but Javi, WAR isn't everything. You always say that yourself. That's true. Admittedly, first base is different than shortstop, second base. In the case of Bogaerts, he's played a little bit of both. It's not a one-to-one connection, and I think that is worth bringing up because wins above replacement, when you play a really good defensive shortstop, it's going to add a lot more to that number, right? Because you have more opportunity, because that position is a lot more important in terms of defensive numbers than it is for first base. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but you just have a lot more time and to accumulate some more. That's why Ha-Seong Kim can be a player that produced, even his rookie year, more than Eric Hosmer did in terms of some of his best years with the Padres, because he at least was providing you really good defensive value, right? That's what happens there with shortstop. So I understand it's not a one-to-one connection. It's different roles to play. And I think that's important. You have to do a lot as a first baseman to be doing doing better than a shortstop like, let's say, Willie Adames or Dansby Swanson, those type of guys where they're giving you a lot of value from the glove alone. And other shortstops give you value from the glove. So I'm just saying it's a little bit hard to compare the two sometimes. Unlike Hosmer, though, there are some injuries, like I explained, with Xander Bogaerts to explain a little bit of the fall off his first year. Right? In terms of differences between Eric Hosmer and Xander Bogaerts, first year, he gets hit on the wrist by the Spencer Strider fastball, and immediately everything plummets in his numbers. And at the end of the season, he starts picking things up a bit. And his wrist is something that has been a long-term issue. While Eric Hosmer never really had a giant injury issue to note. And I think that was why it was even more frustrating to watch him play at times. Then there are more ways in which they differentiate in terms of their on-field play, right? In terms of their on-field play, Xander Bogaerts is just kind of there. He's not necessarily a player that's going to hit for a lot of power, but he just does a little bit of everything. I think that's kind of what you were hoping for from him. And he wasn't pegged as being a defensive stalwart the way that I think Eric Hosmer was, because of the Gold Glove wins, which we've talked about before, and we just talked about in the first segment, that the advanced statistics, at least, don't immediately say that was a correct decision, I think. And I think that we've seen a lot of times that there are some bad players who either win Gold Gloves or are nominated. Juan Soto being a great example, right? He was nominated for a Gold Glove after that 2023 season with the Padres, and we all watched him and we were like, this guy is not a plus defender. Like, you could just tell it's a little bit of a popularity thing. But other than the circumstances of their signing and the fact that they've overall been very disappointing and that they might be hurting the team, that's another thing. Their financial commitment, and this is the fault of the GM, not even necessarily the player, but the financial commitment made to both of these players, big time overpays, is harming the Padres' ability to bring in more players, as you saw this past offseason. That's not their fault. That's the fault of the GM. And frankly, congrats to the agents of both of these guys, both Bogaerts and Hosmer. Like that's their job, to get players as much money as possible. I'm not blaming them for that. But it is very similar. And we've already heard stories like, in order to get rid of Bogaerts, they might have to attach a prospect with him. I remember hearing that for years with Eric Hosmer too. Should they do that? No, you still got to give it a chance. But here's some other areas where they differentiate. And in my opinion, this is the biggest reason for why Xander Bogaerts and Eric Hosmer are just, you cannot put them on the same playing field. The similar way you can't just say, oh, well, in the NBA, if a guy isn't doing well in the playoffs, he's immediately Joel Embiid or James Harden. It's like, no, there's actually a lot of differentiations that pop up, and you shouldn't immediately jump to worst case scenario just because there are some similarities. First of all, it is dangerously frustrating. It's fantastically annoying of a combination of media reporters to constantly rave about a player and then fans not see it. I'm not saying that fans are justified. Fans are morons in a lot of ways. Love you guys, though. You, my faithful listeners, are fantastic, but fans can be morons. Padres, Dodgers, D-backs, Rockies, Yankees, Red Sox, Philadelphia, whatever it is. Some a little bit more than most, I think, because of the size of the fan bases, but they can be really annoying. That being said, I'm just talking about why I think, this isn't even something that I agree with necessarily, but why I think people were frustrated with Hosmer is because it is really frustrating to see media and reporters rave about Hosmer's leadership and locker room presence, but then the fans themselves would like never see him speak up much post-game. Whenever we're hearing about Hosmer playing really poorly or the team is in a nosedive, 2021, for example, you never had Hosmer come out and give one of these speeches or just talk to the media in a way that's like, okay, I am a fan on TV and I just watch the team every day. Put you in that perspective, right? I see it. I see a little bit. Instead, it feels like you're hearing from Manny. Instead, it feels like you're hearing from Tatis. More famous players for sure, and that's a part of it. But I'm hearing more from Joe Musgrove. I'm hearing more from other players that aren't Hosmer. And given how much of a buildup of his reputation, I understand why fans are frustrated to see that. And by the way, I have heard stuff. My own sources have been like, yeah, Hosmer's like a really great locker room guy. And frankly, some of you guys, if you're listening, you've probably seen him on not media tours, but media appearances with his new podcast that he does. Like, seems like a great teammate. It does seem like that is backed up by, from what I've heard, from what people have said, that is true. But that's the problem, is that when you don't see it and when it's constantly used almost as a cudgel, a safeguard against criticism, that's where I think the animosity from the fan base really brewed from, right? But again, that just could be me. And there's more about it, right? Like, if you look up Kevin Acey's article in the San Diego Union Tribune following the 2020 season, it's titled Padres' Eric Hosmer looks to make even more of his changes. And it's referring to when he embraced launch angle. He started lifting the ball in the air more. He had an 855 OPS in those 35 games. This isn't necessarily a shot at Acey, but this just adds on to what I'm saying, where fans are being told something and not seeing it. And we did see it for a second. That was the best time of Eric Hosmer's career, was that 2020 season, especially when he helped break the record, the Grand Slam record, which is the Eric Hosmer Padres legend moment for sure. But overall, to see that article and to see AC talk about these things, and I'm not saying that Hosmer said, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to embrace it. Everybody, I'm a new man. I'm not saying that, but AC talked about it in the article. And then for him to then go right back to being the ground ball gremlin that he was, is just really frustrating to see. And it adds on to what I'm saying, where media are defending this guy and the player and the fans are like, this is too much. Speaking of defending the guy, the players prior to the 2022 season going out and defending him following trade rumors. That leads to more animosity from the fan base, and why I think people hate him so much. Because what is he? Like I said, this guy produced less F4 in 4 seasons than Xander Bogaerts did in his first season. First base and shortstop 1-to-1 comparisons aside. And some of them are negative. Following the 2021 season, Eric Hosmer was like, this was really becoming a thing where fans were just losing their minds, right? They're just like, what's going on here? And in 2021, he was good for 0.9 wins above replacement. That's pretty rough out of a player that you're paying this much, right? And he's just not carrying the ball the way that we thought he might be changing to do. And then players are coming out and defending him. And look, I get it to a degree. What else are players going to do? That's what players do. And it's totally justified that they do, because I would be frustrated too hearing a bunch of idiots like named Javier who have a dumb Twitter handle named after a pepper or whatever, right? Like mouthing off about how they're messing up the team. I get why as professional athletes that's frustrating. But bottom line, people see that and they're like, you guys just came off of like the biggest choke job in franchise history, and Eric Hosmer was a player who did not produce well again, following some optimism that he was going to start carrying the ball more, and you guys are battling and trying to defend him. It just seems bad optically, right? Another thing, found new ways to be bad, at least defensively. Yes, you can go look up on YouTube the video that my guy Tommy did detailing some of his worst moments, right? Like showing some of his worst moments. And it wasn't just, he's a bad player. It was like he made stuff you've never seen before. Hitting ground balls from pitches that are outside and away of the zone, right? And smashing that ball into the ground. Or defensively, some highlights. The Ha-Seong Kim play. When Ha-Seong Kim is veering out to the outfield and Hosmer, for some reason, is waiting for the ball to get there instead of seeing that, immediately running to first, planting, and catching it. And that little bit of a difference probably gets the out, right? Like that. Those are some things. The dropped ball against the Astros. A lot of the throws from Tatis that he missed. The one where he spun himself around is very weird. Go look up the video on YouTube. It's just, I think it's titled like Eric Hosmer is the worst player in baseball, something hyperbolic like that. But that is part of it. So he found new ways. And then, you have some other little media things. The way he snapped at Jeff Sanders of the San Diego Union Tribune for asking about the trade rumors. I believe this was in 2022, 2021. I forgot when exactly this was. And some people commented, they're like, Will Myers has been in trade rumors since 2016, and I never saw him snap at a reporter. But in defense of Eric Hosmer, he might have been asked that already by the time Jeff had been asking him it, and I understand being a little bit frustrated by that. I don't recall that being a thing. I don't remember there being like a lot of questions being thrown at him at that time about being traded, but I also understand like being a little bit annoyed by that. But again, that is something that adds on to why people couldn't stand this. And lastly, I think most importantly, in terms of why he became such a maligned figure, was he never ingratiated himself with San Diego. I saw more from Jackson Merrill his first year, frankly, right, than I did with Eric Hosmer. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but for example, he never went on Ben and Woods, which is one of the premier radio talk shows for Padres fans in San Diego. It's a big show. I've talked with Ben Higgins a couple of times myself. Like, they're great. Everybody likes them. And they reached out. They literally came out after Eric Hosmer was traded, and they were like, we reached out, and we never got him on. And that says a lot, considering they had everyone on that show. So I think those are the reasons that people hated Eric Hosmer so much, and why it's much different than Xander Bogaerts. Xander Bogaerts has not had any such vibes of acting weirdly, or it seems like he owns up to everything. He's played a good teammate. I'm not saying that he doesn't have good moments or bad moments or vice versa, right? I'm just saying there hasn't been that vibe of, wow, this guy doesn't want to be here. He never goes on Ben and Woods. He never wants to, whatever it is. I think that all of that adds up, and Xander just does not have the litany of things that I've mentioned so far in this segment for why he could be the next Eric Hosmer. But let me tell you, there's some other differences between these two guys. Oh yeah, we're not done yet. We're going to talk about some of the last things, and in terms of looking forward to 2025, what we can hope for, and closing out this episode, hopefully, on a positive note. But first, a few words from our sponsors. And just like that, everybody, we are back thriving and vibing on this final segment of this show to talk a little bit about some hope for Xander Bogaerts. And why? Let me tell you, folks. We are in a dangerous position. Now, here's the thing. One last difference between Xander Bogaerts and Eric Hosmer. Xander Bogaerts around, let's say, this reminds me a little bit of the vibe we had about Bogaerts is a little bit similar to the vibe we had about Hosmer, maybe heading into the 2021 season, or maybe heading into the 2022 season, whatever, around that time, these last few years, where you're a little bit hopeful, right? But unlike Hosmer, there are like at least some reasons to believe in him, right? Like there are at least some evidence to believe in him. And there's also some reasons why we're all scared, right? So it's a similarity and a difference in this last segment that we're going to talk about here. So let's get to it. The reasons to be scared, Eric Hosmer, they were obvious. He never hit for enough power. right? This is a thing that we know, and he always hit the ball on the ground, and we were like, oh my God, these things aren't trending poorly, or aren't trending well. And then all of a sudden, you have a little bit of a mirage in 2020, then 2021 happens, and then we're heading into 2022 being like, this is still a mess, this is still a really bad player, right? That's where we were at. Eric Hosmer, he had 25 home runs with the Royals, had 18 with the Padres his first year, then 22 in 2019, but it didn't matter. He was just such a mess defensively, and at least Bogaerts had that. There was almost no hope, I think. That's one difference, at least to me, when you got towards the tail end of the Hosmer era. There was kind of no hope that he would be good. Bad defensive player, hit the ball way too much on the ground. He hit the ball hard, which was good. He had a good batting average, but didn't walk enough, wasn't fast enough, and in general, we're kind of like, this is done. We don't see anything changing with Eric Hosmer. With Xander Bogaerts, there is similarly like a lot of things that are on the down, right? We've talked about this before on this podcast. His walk rate has gone down for years, right? Since 2021, 10.3, then 9, then 8.4, then 6 last year. That's already one thing, right? His strikeout rate has gone up every year since 2021, or actually 2022 was the same. But then it didn't go up, I should say. It went up just from 2023. My mistake, everybody. It went up from 2023 from 16.5% to 17.1%. So that was a little tiny thing to point out. But more so than that, he has a lower expected weighted on base mark every single year. It's been getting lower. 340 in 2020, then 359, then 323, then 318, then 305. That's pretty damn concerning. And then after that, right, his first strike percentage, so the percentage of pitches going against him that he ends up getting a first strike on them, it was up 60.8%, which is not good, in 2023 to 66.5% in 2024. That's really bad. His hard hit rate, my favorite advanced stat for beginners, has gone down every single year since 2021. 43%, 39.5%, 34.6%, and then 33.2%. My lordy, that's a lot of bad stuff. Those are a lot of bad numbers, guys. You just don't want to be on that. And considering that this is a player that never exactly hit for a lot of power, that's not exactly what Xander Bogaerts is known for, right? I don't think that I'm breaking any news there, right? Like, that's just not what he was known for. In terms of home runs, he had a 33 home run year in 2019, but I think everybody knew, like, a lot of balls just happened to carry out that year. Juiced ball era, too. He is a guy that can maybe hit you 20 at most. That's what I feel like he is. Right? He has the big season 2021 with 23. But other than that, he's not a big home run guy, but he is a doubles guy. He hit 52 in 2019. He hit 34 and 38. Like, he's been a really, really good player in terms of just hitting for a decent amount of power, getting on base, hitting the ball well, just being a solid producer on a team. And he's produced in big moments before too. But the power, even still, when you see all those things going down, it is worrisome. So both of these players, they did have moments where you were like, oh man, both of them, the numbers don't look that good, guys. We don't really have a lot of reason to believe in him. But unlike Eric Hosmer, it's not as set in stone, I think, the way we were at the tail end of Eric Hosmer's time. In terms of reasons of optimism, Xander Bogaerts' pull rate was up from last season, and generally speaking, sorry, I'm talking a little bit too fast. Generally speaking, that is a pretty good development, right? It was up a little bit last year, from 36.6 to 41.7%, suggesting that he's going to tap into a little bit more power. That's good. And with Petco, left field is okay, right? Then after that, his zone contact rate was up from 87.5% in 23 to 91.1%, which is excellent. So compound that with a higher swing percentage, 42.6 in 23 to 44.2 in 2024, and a slight uptick in his zone swing percentage. There's some suggestion that the batting average at minimum is expected to go up. And in fact, his expected batting average was in the 74th percentile of Major League Baseball, right? Like, it's expected that he was going to be a lot better than his batting average ended up being, which is nice. And considering that batting average is something that is really integral to his game, one of the things that we'll see with him, it wouldn't shock me if he's a 280 hitter this year. It really wouldn't. And that's good. That is going to be a productive player, most likely, considering that he's Xander Bogaerts and he's done it many years before. And speaking of some other reasons for optimism, it's simple, but it's true. He's Xander Bogaerts. We couldn't say that with Eric Hosmer. Xander Bogaerts was genuinely, objectively a very good to solid baseball player for a long time with the Boston Red Sox. With Eric Hosmer, you were like, is this guy good? I don't know if those gold gloves are worth it. And he really has to hit his way past his defense because his defense wasn't giving you all that much. And he was also a very every other year player that was greatly helped by BABIP sometimes, which BABIP, for those who don't know, batting average on balls in play, it happens every now and then. When you're just a guy who, one thing Eric Hosmer was good at is making contact with the ball and putting it in play. Sometimes you will have months where you're excellent, right? And in some ways, entire seasons, because you just are good at putting the ball in play. I think that's also conducive to having some playoff success too, versus guys who swing for the fences every time. If you just go through a bad 2-week stretch, it's not going to look good, right? Because your main thing is power. But Eric Hosmer, like I said, with you being able to have a good stretch when you're a player like this, he hit a 199 WRC plus in March and April, his last season with the Padres, right? But why did that happen? Because, guys, of the BABIP, 439 batting average on balls in play. And considering he isn't super fast, it was clear that that was going to decline, and it did. But with Xander Bogaerts, unlike Eric Hosmer, we have seen that these previous seasons, he's been very good. Here's his F4 mark every single year since 2015. 4.6, 3.6, 3.3, 4.6, 6, 1.6 in 2020, which is excellent, by the way, in this shortened season. 4.1, 6. Those are really good numbers. Like, he had for years been a very, very good player, and even at times shown okay value when you needed him the most. Xander Bogaerts, much bigger name, and much more, I think, prior to all of this, being viewed as that guy's a good player, right? He's a good player, and he has a crisp swing. We love seeing him loft doubles through the gap, all that stuff, right? So you have some hope there. Lastly, actually not lastly, we got a couple more things. Good defense. Right? Xander Bogaerts very quietly has produced decent defensive value with the Padres. In terms of as a shortstop, his first season, he had 3 outs above average. It's not bad. Last year, he didn't play as much shortstop, but what he did play was second base, where he had 6 outs above average. He actually plays a good defensive position, right? He's actually pretty okay there, right? And I think that there is some hope that he can at least be decent in that respect. Maybe not Ha-Seong Kim level, but a decent shortstop who at the very least is not going to hurt you defensively the way that some other guys have hurt the team in the past. Let's say Fernando Tatis Jr., for example. Then, moving on from that, it is the simple fact that he was dealing with some obvious things. He was dealing with health issues. He reached for a ground ball in 2024 and messed up his arm. In 2023, he got hit with the pitch. Maybe now, with him healthier, with him losing some weight in the offseason, people might be excited and saying, now that he's fully healthy, what can he produce? We have a little bit of optimism there. And then lastly, I don't know how much this changes, guys, and what they produce in terms of the bat, but he's back at his natural position at shortstop. And the first season with the Padres, remember, it's not that he was bad. He was just historically otherworldly bad, right? In clutch situations. But the skills were there. He did hit the ball. He just didn't hit the ball with guys on base. And that's something that usually doesn't translate year to year, as we saw with the 2024 team. Right? Everybody it was an extreme slingshot back to hitting to the point where they were miles and miles ahead of everybody else in the league with runners in scoring position. If he just does that, if he's a 115 WRC plus guy who hits 280, plays some decent defense, that's a good player, right? And at this point, that is good enough for this team. It's in term not good enough for this team. It is, we'll take it. Considering that I think it's been made pretty obvious that the contract, for all the reasons we've talked about in this episode, with the positionals that the positions that they already had filled and all of the roster constraints that they've had this offseason, probably it was a mistake, but you can hope. And I think that's why the comparison to Eric Hosmer is just extremely, extremely, extremely wrought. Whether it be for on-field, whether it be for health, whether it be for his off-field stuff, whether it be for the personality, whether it be for media coverage, whether it be for contract, whether it be for simple stats, right? And whether it be for the reasons we've actually seen for optimism, I think these players are gigantically different. And in not just talking about positions, I think that Eric Hosmer is in a different level as of right now. Xander Bogaerts, he could very well get to that point at some point, but it isn't today. And folks, that's all I have to say. For today's edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Tell your friends about it and whatnot. Going to be starting to upload more clips and be a little bit more active on the channel. I'm just trying to figure out how to use a couple applications to make them. Look forward to that on the channel. We're almost at 2,100 subscribers. All of you subscribers, feel free to leave me some questions and comments on Twitter /X or Blue Sky at Javipeno, Javiipeno. We'll answer them on Monday, as well as the YouTube comments. We're almost there, though, guys. We're almost there. And we've got some fun episodes on the horizon. Monday's going to be the mailbag. We're going to do more spring training updates on Tuesday. We're also going to go through the Padres bullpen history and the way I've been going through the starting pitching, whether they've had a good history at putting together the back end of the starting rotation, and then the way I went through the back end of the lineup. We're also going to do some bullpen caps. Are they going to be able to put together a good bullpen? Recent history says, well, you'll just have to wait and see. And we might do some fantasy baseball talk with Miller next week, or talk about some of our biggest bust picks for everybody in the National League West who isn't going to be as good, not even just in a fantasy sense, just in general. So don't worry, the content is going to keep on rolling, everybody. And the good times, hopefully, will also continue to roll at a commensurate rate. But until that next time, everybody, stay safe and, of course, stay faithful. My Friday Faithful homies, take care.